Distracted driving isn't just a problem in Texas. It's a serious problem all over the United States. Dave Teater from the National Safety Council is an expert on the topic. NSC is a national nonprofit organization committed to helping its 20,000 corporate members reduce risk and improve safety, and it was the first organization in the nation to call for a ban of all cell phone use while driving. Dave leads the National Safety Council efforts to reduce deaths and injuries associated with cell phone distracted driving. Prior to joining the National Safety Council, Dave was the chief executive for a number of companies, including a strategic consulting firm that served the auto industry. He's a frequent speaker on distracted driving and has testified before Congress and has featured in many national publications and news broadcasts on the subject. Today, Dave will deliver our keynote and give us an overview of the national distracted driving epidemic. He will address why this is a critical safety issue and one that business can't ignore. I'd like to welcome Dave Teater.
Thank you, Carol. Well, good morning, everybody, and thank you, Zach and John and Carol, for getting us started. In the next 45 minutes or so, I'm going to share with you some general overview information about distracted driving. You know, if you think about it, isn't it kind of surprising that we could spend a whole day talking about distracted driving? Can't we just say, let's not drive distracted and be done with it? You know, it seems like it ought to be that simple, but I think you'll find out it's not. There's a lot more to it. As you heard, I haven't always been in this business. This is a second career for me. I was in business just like all of you for many years. I had one of the very first cell phones. I think it was in the late 1980s. I lived and worked in Michigan. We didn't call them cell phones back then. You remember what we called them? Bag phones, I hear, bricks. We actually called them car phones. The first ones we called them car phones. The reason we called them car phones, that's the only place you could get one. They were so big, the first one I had, they mounted in the trunk. I had to make an appointment, bring the car in, they mounted in the trunk. There was an antenna sticking out of the back windshield, and they mounted a handset on the dashboard. They didn't work very well because the networks weren't very well built, so calls dropped all the time, so it was just short phone calls. But I used to do a lot of driving from the west side of the state to the east side of the state where our clients were, and I was on the road all the time. I probably drove 30 or 40,000 miles a year, and when this invention came out, I thought, wow, what a great productivity tool. And I became a heavy car phone user. The technology advanced, they got smaller, you could do more things on them. The networks got built up, so calls didn't drop, and we start using them for other things and longer calls. And now look where we are today, okay? Think about it. We got this multi-billion-dollar worldwide industry with these really neat inventions. Today, the cell phone that most of us carry around with us, I've heard, has more computing power than the entire first NASA moonshot project did back in the late 1960s on that one phone. And it's only been, what, 20 years that it's come that far? Think how far that's advanced and how it's dramatically changed the way we communicate with each other. We can do things now today that we could only do sitting in a chair wired to the wall years ago. We can do all kinds of stuff, which means we can also do them behind the wheel of a car. There was an event in my neighborhood back in the early 2000s that caused me to look at the research around specifically cell phone distracted driving, and I was shocked at what I saw 10 years ago on this. One thing led to another, and now I have the opportunity to talk to groups like you on almost a full-time basis on this danger. When I got into this business, and many of you are in the safety business, traffic safety business, so you'll know a lot of this stuff, but I found out what a big deal car crashes are. We've lost 1 million people in the last 25 years in this country. We lose about 35,000 every year. Now that number's been steadily coming down, although it's been between that 35 and 60,000 number for 50 years probably, okay? Crashes per million miles driven and fatalities per million miles driven has been steadily coming down for 60 years, thank goodness. Okay, but I'll show you in a minute. If you look at that trend line, it seems to have started to level off a little bit in the last 10 years. Arguably, when some of the most advanced safety practices have come to our roadways, to our vehicles, yet that rate of decline has started to level off a little bit. Could it be there's another threat in front of us? Motor vehicle crashes are the leading cause of workplace fatalities. They're the leading cause of accidental death in this country. They're the leading cause of all death in this country, accidental or otherwise, for everybody in the age group of about 5 to 35 years old. There's a couple of years in there where I think poisonings are greater, but for the vast majority of this age group, they're more likely to die in a car crash than any other form of death, period, accidental or otherwise. Teens in that 15 to 20 age group, more likely to die in a car crash than the next 3 leading causes of death combined: homicide, suicide, and cancer. This is a really big deal. John alluded to it. Huge impact on society financially. $100 billion a year we estimate throughout the country. We seem to have grown a little complacent. Take that 35,000, divide it by the number of days in a year. It's about 100 people a day die in this country on our nation roadways. What would we do if a plane crashed today and 100 people died? And then again tomorrow, and then again the next day. That's been going on our nation's roadways every single day for 50, 60 years. Every single day. In the next 30 days, in the next month, we'll lose as many Americans on our nation's roadways as we have brave young men and women in Afghanistan in the last 10 years. That'll happen in the next 30 days on our nation's roadways. Yet we seem to have grown a little bit complacent. I want to show you a very short film clip. Some of you have probably seen this. This is actual film taken in San Francisco on the top of a trolley, an old film camera mounted on the top of a trolley about 100 years ago, when cars were first coming on our roadways. Watch how we drive back then and compare it to how we drive today. Okay, so this is Market Street. See this trolley coming? This camera is mounted on a trolley going the other way. You can see horses. You can see early car there on the left. Here comes an early car. This is before we invented left turn lanes. We just kind of turned when we felt like it back then. I think here comes a bicyclist up on the left. Remember, this camera's on the top of one of these new big trolleys. Watch this guy coming up on the right. Right here, he's going to cut right now in front of the trolley. He's going to miss the horse crossing in front of him just barely. He misses it. That's how we drove 100 years ago. Now, when I show this in Chicago, everybody says nothing's changed. We still drive that way. Keep this in mind. It's part of the theme for the whole day. Things have changed, haven't they? Is there any reason to believe that right now, today, we got it all figured out and nothing's ever going to change again? And 20 years from now, 50 years from now, 100 years from now, we're going to be driving exactly the same? Of course not. We need to go with the change. We need to understand new threats when they present themselves. And the premise of what I'm going to say today is we as a group are faced with a new threat that we never dreamed we'd have to face, and it's come upon us very, very quickly. And it's the result of the rapid adoption of mobile communications technology and things we can do behind the wheel of a car that we never could do just a few years back. Okay, what causes traffic crashes? You know, it's not the easiest thing to determine. Those of you in law enforcement know that. Crashes are chaotic. People don't tell the truth. They don't remember, okay? Almost always, though, there's multiple causes of crashes. It's not a singular cause. If you got a young person who's a novice driver, still learning to drive, driving after dark, which is a little more difficult, on rain-slickened roads with a couple of buddies in the car, yapping at them, and they have a crash. What caused the crash? The inexperience, the slippery roads, the night driving, the passenger distraction, probably a little bit of all. Okay? It's hard to know what primary causes of crashes are. The auto industry has published these numbers. We think they're pretty good. They believe somewhere between 10 and 13% of crashes are primarily caused by vehicle maintenance issues. And we've heard a lot about that. It's been in the news a lot lately. But the vast majority of this, 90% of this number, are tire issues, improperly inflated or maintained tires. It's all about tires. Things like ignition failures or sudden acceleration, as dramatic and as bad as they are when they happen, it's a very small number of crashes. Environmental factors, more so probably up north, but roads, slippery roads, visibility issues, somewhere between 20 and 33%. But look at this one. Human error. Human error causes at least 70% of crashes, and virtually every researcher you talk to in this business will tell you they think it's somewhere north of 90% of crashes. The primary cause is human error. So we're losing 100 people a day, 30-some thousand a year. It's been going on for 50 or 60 years, and you could argue that maybe 90% of those are 100% preventable. A lot of smart people have been looking. You're going to hear from some this afternoon, have been looking at this issue of human error. Where does it come from? They know that driver inattention, driver distraction is a major component of that. When we talk about driver distraction, they tend to fall in one of three categories. Okay, we're going to have a little bit of a science lesson on driver distraction. Visual distraction is when our eyes are taken off the road. We're not watching the road. We all understand that. Mechanical distractions, when our hands are off the wheel. We all know the person, eating a hamburger and driving with their knees, right? Cognitive distraction, though, is when our mind is off the task of driving. It's not focused on the task of driving. You heard Zach mention something about this earlier. We're going to talk more about cognitive distraction in the next few minutes, not because it's the most dangerous. You could argue that probably visual distraction has got to be the most dangerous, but because we don't understand it as well. When we're visually and mechanically distracted, we know we are, and we maybe compensate for it. If we're reaching in a backpack or a briefcase or a purse in the passenger seat looking for something, we know at that moment we're not on the top of our game. So we may actually be a little more focused on the drive, and we certainly don't look in that backpack for 10 seconds. We look for 1 or 2, and we go back to the forward roadway. If we're mentally or cognitively distracted, it lasts a long time, and we don't know we're distracted. I used to drive from Detroit to Grand Rapids, across the state of Michigan a lot. And I'd be on the phone, having a conference call, and I'd hang up the phone, and I'd kind of notice the forward roadway, and I wouldn't remember what side of Lansing, Michigan I was on. Lansing's our capital. It's right in the middle of the drive. Have you ever had that? You hung up the phone, you don't remember the last 10 miles, or maybe you missed an exit? I should have been a clue that something was going on in my head that was preventing me from being engaged as I should be in the task of driving. I want to talk about 3 characteristics of cognitive distraction. The first, and Zach alluded to this, the human brain does not truly multitask. There's no debate on this. You talk to any cognitive psychologist, they've known this for years. The human brain switches tasks. It doesn't do 2 cognitively demanding tasks at the same time. Most of us can walk and chew gum. But how many of you, if you're sitting at home reading a book, reading the newspaper, you're in your easy chair and the phone rings, do you answer the phone and keep right on reading? Or you're watching a television show and the phone rings. Do you keep right on watching the show and talk to somebody on the phone? Most of us would say, no, I can't do that. Think about that for a minute. What's it take to read a book? You need your hands to hold it. You need your eyes to look at it. And you need your brain to interpret what you're seeing. What do you need to drive a car? You need your hands to hold the wheel. You need your eyes to see the environment. You need your brain to interpret what's happening out there and how you need to respond to it. Now, we would never dream of reading a book and talking on a phone. But somehow we think you're almost required to talk on the phone. After all, they're car phones, right? While driving. What happens if you make a mistake reading a book? You go back and reread part of it, right? I do that all the time. I start daydreaming. I have to go back and reread something. What happens if you make a mistake driving a car? Could impact you for the rest of your lives. We'll hear some stories about that later. The human brain does not truly multitask. It toggle tasks. It switches back and forth. Some people are better switchers than others, and you probably know who you are. Some people are really bad switchers. They can only focus on one thing. When we're focused on 2 tasks, switching back and forth, one is always primary and one is always secondary. And guess what? When we're driving and talking on a phone, it's the talking task that's primary, not the driving task, which kind of goes back to the book analogy and what the difference might be. If I'm not paying attention to a paragraph in a book, I got to go reread it. If I'm not paying attention for a few seconds or maybe even a few minutes driving down the road, I can generally get away with it. If nothing happens, I can generally get away with it. I'm not driving well, but nothing happens, so I assume I must have done a good job. So the driving task is always secondary. Lastly, cognitive distraction, this is key, actually results in visual distraction. We all understand how important it is to see the environment when we're driving. It takes 2 forms. The first one is called inattention blindness. That's what happened to me when I couldn't remember what side of Lansing I was on. That's when we're looking straight ahead but not seeing everything in our environment. We see this in simulations all the time. People are driving in a simulator, talking on a phone, and they'll get done and they'll run a red light. They won't cause a crash, but they'll run a red light, and we'll ask them afterwards, how do you think you drove? They say, I drove fine. We say, what about the red light? They say, what red light? They never saw it. The other form is called tunnel vision, and that's when we stop scanning the forward roadway. Those of you who have been in any advanced driver training know that we teach something called defensive driving. The safest form of driving is for you to be scanning the forward roadway, not looking at the car right in front of you, looking 1 or 2 ahead, scanning back and forth, and actively identifying hazards. So I'm driving down the road and I'm scanning and I see somebody getting into a parked car. Maybe they're going to pull out in front of me and I see a green light up ahead. Maybe it's going to turn yellow. I got to be prepared for that. And I'm on the freeway and I'm in somebody's blind spot and somebody's about to merge to their right. I need to think, well, maybe they're going to switch lanes and not see me. I'm actively identifying potential hazards. That's the safest form of driving. Well, when you're using a cell phone while driving, any form of cell phone while driving, you're not doing that. You're not identifying hazards, and you're also, for some reason, you're stop scanning. Now, you can see this in airports. Watch people walking and talking on a phone in an airport, where you see it all the time, maybe in a shopping mall. You know, they're not walking along like this, right? They're not engaged in the talk. They're kind of focused straight ahead about 10 feet. And they're just walking probably a little slower, and they don't see their surroundings. They drive the same way. You pull up to next to somebody on a freeway who's on a cell phone, you look over at them, maybe you want to give them the evil eye because they're not driving very good. They don't even know you're there. They're just focused straight ahead. There's a form of research, traffic safety research, called naturalistic driving studies, where they put cameras and all kinds of monitoring equipment in cars, and they did that up in Canada, and they had an eye tracker, and they were measuring somebody's eye movement while they were driving in a real car, and the only thing they were doing was driving. That's a single task of driving. Look what happened when they picked up when they got on a hands-free phone call. That field of vision just focused right down. A whole bunch of stuff drops out of the field of vision because we stop scanning. This actually happened in Texas. This was from one of our former employees in the state of Texas. She wrote me this. She said, Thursday evening I was in my car, stopped at a traffic light after the light turned green, but before the car in front of me had time to start through the intersection, I was hit from behind. In talking with the woman who hit me, I found out that she was on her phone, but she assured me she was driving safely because she was using her built-in hands-free system in her Lincoln SUV. She said that she saw the light was green, but guess she just didn't notice that the cars weren't moving yet. Fortunately, nobody was hurt. Think of that box, that tunnel vision box. It was up on the light. It didn't even see the cars underneath. We have all kinds of examples of this from cognitive distraction. People looking straight ahead and not seeing stuff. Okay, all that's interesting, but is it causing crashes? If you think about it, that's the only reason we're here. Some of us might be in the insurance property damage business, but most of us are here because we don't want people to get injured or lose their lives. And that only happens in crashes. I want to share with you one of the most misunderstood things about cell phone distracted driving. When people talk about distraction crash risk, we almost solely, even researchers, focus on one thing, and that's how risky is it? Okay? How risky is it to text and drive? How risky is it to talk on a phone and drive? How risky is it to eat a hamburger or put on makeup? You know, we talk about risk. Some things are certainly riskier than others. They're hard to measure, just like everything else in this business. This is an example of some measurements. I think most of these came out of naturalistic driving study. The numbers on the right are what they call risk ratios or odds ratios of crashing. And the way you look at this, look at the second one down. If you're reaching for a moving object while driving, you're almost 9 times more likely to get in a crash at that moment. It's a very risky thing to do. If you're talking on a cell phone, you're 4 times more likely to get in a crash. We've got probably 30 studies that have looked at that. The lowest ones are a few naturalistic driving studies that are down below 2. There's a few up around 6 times more likely to crash. A whole bunch of them, including 2 big epidemiological studies, fall right in at 4 times. We think it's a pretty good number. You're 4 times more likely to get in a crash. If you're texting, at least 8 times. That's the best number we've been able to. We don't have a lot of risk ratios on texting yet. Believe it or not, it's still kind of a new thing. But that's the best one we've been able to find. It's really dangerous. Okay, but, and this is the thing people don't understand, this is only half the story. The other half of the story is, how often are you exposed to the risk? Why aren't we having a whole day session today on the dangers of putting on makeup while driving down the road? Or some of these naturalistic driving studies have actually caught people changing their clothes while driving down the road. You know? That's got to be off the charts risky. Why aren't we having an all-day session on changing clothes while driving down the road? Because thank goodness not many people do it. We aren't exposed to that risk very often. If you've got a really bad risk, but we're not exposed to it hardly ever, it's causing very few crashes. Now, every crash is important. Okay, but if we're looking at this kind of from a public health standpoint, we want to go where we can save the most lives the fastest. And the thing that sets cell phone use apart from every other distraction is not that necessarily it's the most dangerous, although texting is probably one of the most riskiest things we can do while driving. But cell phone conversations at 4 times. Now, would you choose to increase your crash risk 300%, 4-fold? Of course not. So it's still pretty dangerous. But it's certainly not one of the most dangerous things you can do. Why are we so focused on it? Because we're exposed to it so much, okay? Another thing that's hard to measure in this business, but NHTSA every year sends people out to observe intersections around the country. It's 3 people, 2 observers, 1 recorder. I think they go to about 3,000 intersections. It's called the NOPA study. Started out just looking at safety belt usage. For the last 10 years, they've been also looking at cell phone usage. Now, they can't tell if somebody's on a hands-free phone, so they do representative polling and all these and get a ratio to use for hands-free usage. In 2012, the most recent data, they observed about 1.5% of people at any given moment, and that's key, any given moment, were manipulating a cell phone. They don't know if they're dialing or texting, probably texting, the vast majority of it. But look at the one below that. Talking on a cell phone, 9% of all drivers at any given moment. Now, most of you may think that doesn't sound like a very big number based on what you see. Keep in mind that we remember bad behavior, we don't remember good behavior. So something you see you think happens a lot, it's probably a little less than that. But you put those two numbers together, 10% of all drivers at any given moment are distracted by cell phone use. That's off the charts. We can't even measure things like putting on makeup or eating a hamburger. Again, sometimes when we see it, we remember it, it sticks with us, but it doesn't happen all that often. Cell phone use is off the charts as far as our exposure to risk. And crashes are the result of the risk and the exposure to risk. And when you put those two things together, and we did this, we believe that in 2012, about 5% of all crashes involved texting. We believe about 21% involved talking on a phone. Not because it's more dangerous, because we're exposed to it so much more. So think back to the video now. We got, for an activity, a distraction, a threat that didn't exist to any great degree just 10, 15, 20 years ago, we now think 1/4 of all crashes involve cell phone use. 1/4 of all crashes. I want to share with you a few studies. The Insurance Institute for Highway Safety, they're the crash dummy people. They did what's referred to as an epidemiological study. They were looking at a relationship between variables. They wanted to see what the relationship was between talking on a cell phone and getting involved in a crash, and in this case, getting hurt in a crash. So they hung out in hospital emergency rooms, and when people came in who had been injured, but not too seriously, if they could get 2 things, the exact time of the crash, which is sometimes hard to get, and their cell records, then they put them in the study. Over the course of a year, they got about 600 participants. They did this fancy case crossover statistical analysis. They came up with a couple of findings. They were one of the first to come up with you're 4 times more likely, in this case, to get hurt in a crash. Not just in a crash, but get hurt in a crash if you're using a cell phone while driving. And secondly, they did this study in a city that had recently passed a handheld ban. So they had people in the study who were both on handheld and hands-free phones, and guess what? There was no difference. The risk was exactly the same. Now, I'm guessing most of you have kind of heard this by now. I used to get a lot of people going, what? We've got over 30 studies that have set out to find a safety benefit to using hands-free devices, and not a one has been able to do that. That's one of the other big myths on this, that somehow you're safer by using a hands-free phone. What changes when you go to a Bluetooth or a hands-free phone? I mean, the only thing that really changes is you're putting one hand back on the steering wheel, right? We've been driving manual transmissions for years and not worried about a hand off the steering wheel. Obviously, 10 and 2 is the safest position, especially if you have a blowout or something. But we can't calculate an odds ratio of crashing for having one hand off the steering wheel. That's the only thing that changes. How many of you can read your favorite book or watch your favorite television show and talk on a Bluetooth device? It doesn't make any difference. Your mind is no longer engaged in the task of driving. You're not scanning the forward roadway, and you're not seeing everything in front of you. How's this compare to drunk driving? The folks at University of Utah took 40 adult subjects. They had them drive in a simulation to get a baseline performance. They came back a month later. They drove while talking on a handheld phone. They came back a month later and drove while talking on a hands-free phone. In the final experiment, they came back a month later, no cell phone, but 0.08 blood alcohol level. They gave them, I think, orange juice and vodka to get up to the 0.08 level. And even in Utah, they had no trouble recruiting for the study. They were lined up to get in. Couple of interesting results. Again, the handheld and hands-free subjects drove exactly the same, good or bad. There was no difference. Didn't make any difference. And secondly, those at the 0.08 level got in slightly more crashes and had slower reaction times, had better reaction times. The cell phone drivers were worse than the drunk drivers, slightly, okay? Now, there's some big differences between these two issues, and I want to put a big disclaimer out here. Remember that drunk drivers are drunk for the entire journey. A cell phone driver at any given moment can stop being impaired by hanging up the phone, and that's a big difference. Okay? Also, there have been about 3 or 4 of these studies. They've all come to the same conclusion. This is by far the most scientific. The cable show Mythbusters did one. Road and Track magazine did one. They've all come to the same conclusion. The .08 drunk drivers drove better than the cell phone drivers. Handheld or hands-free, didn't matter. But they only looked at that .08 level. And my understanding is a lot of our more serious drunk driving crashes happen at higher levels. And I, for a moment, don't believe that somebody at twice the legal limit is a safer driver than a cell phone driver. That's not what we're saying. The other thing is there's been some debate about how good simulators are at measuring crash risk, because maybe we behave differently in the real world. I'm not sure I believe that, but it's a reasonable argument. So throw out the crash part of this. Simulators are excellent at measuring reaction time. And I think what you can conclude from this study and the others like this is 10% of all drivers at any given moment on Texas roadways or anywhere have slower reaction times than if they were drunk at the .08 level. And that's scary. And I think that's probably an accurate conclusion from this. Lastly, the folks at Carnegie Mellon they were able to combine a brain scan and a driving simulator, an fMRI and a driving simulator. They wanted to see what was going on in the brain while we were driving. This brain on the left, that's the occipital parietal lobe. That red part is what was engaged for the task of driving. Look what happened when they got on a hands-free cell phone. The brain on the same person, same brain. The only thing that changed is instead of just driving, they were now listening to questions and answering yes or no on a hands-free phone. 37% reduction in the part of the brain they use for the task of driving. This is a great visual picture of how we don't truly multitask. We toggle tasks. We switch resources back and forth. Okay, I want to talk about a few. By the way, if any of you are research junkies, there are hundreds of these studies out there. 2 of the 3 I just shared with you are the ones I looked at 10 years ago. Okay, this isn't necessarily new research. A lot of this has been out there for a long time. Let me talk about a few misperceptions. This is a question that gets asked a lot. It's a very reasonable question on the surface. You know, crashes, fatalities, and even crashes and fatalities per million miles driven has been coming down. Well, how can that be if cell phone use has skyrocketed over the last 10 years? How can crashes and fatalities keep coming down? The answer isn't a simple one, but the answer is there's way too many variables to narrow it down to one. This is the trend in fatalities per million miles driven going back to 1970. Now, fatalities per million miles driven is probably the best way for us to measure it because it takes into effect exposure, right? But recessions do impact this number because we know that some of our highest risk drivers, like young people, don't drive as much in a recession when they're unemployed and gas prices are high. Okay, so recessions have impact, and some of these dips you see are recessionary dips. But look what happened. You know, cell phones came in right about here. Look at this trend line. Now look what happened right about where cell phones are. Now here's that mammoth recession we were in. I don't know how many of you can see this, but we had the first increase in this number we've had in 6 years last year. Now I can't sit here and say to you this is because of cell phones. I don't know. Okay, but look at all the things. You can't read this, but this is airbags in all vehicles. This is everybody wearing seat belts. This is stability control. This is center lane crossover barriers. All the stuff we've done in highway engineering and law enforcement, high visibility enforcement, enforcing drunk driving laws, vehicle technology to make cars safer. All this stuff, so much of it has happened in the last 10 years, and for some reason that trend line stopped going down as much as it was before. Could it be because I don't know. But the point is, you can't just cherry pick one thing and say our crash experience should have gone up unless I know the impact of all these other things, which I don't know. No more dangerous than talking to a passenger. This is a really good question. There's 2 big distinctions here. The first one is it takes more effort to talk to a passenger, more cognitive effort. Okay, it's a lot easier to talk to somebody you can see. Just try. If you're going to have a difficult conversation with a spouse or an employee, you don't want to do it on the phone. You know. I get asked to do webinars every now and then. I absolutely hate them. They're a lot harder for me. I'm sitting there talking into a phone. I can see you. I can see if you're engaged. I know what the audience looks like. I mean, it's a lot harder to do something, have a conversation with somebody you can't see. That's number one. But the biggest difference is the passenger, like it or not, is helping us drive, right? When was the last time, you kind of know these numbers I started with, when was the last time you sat in the front passenger seat and paid no attention to the forward roadway? We're watching it. If we see something we don't think the driver sees, first of all, our conversation stops. So we mediate, we kind of help them switch. And secondly, we might point it out to them. Backseat drivers may be obnoxious, But for an adult driver, and this is key difference from a teen, but for an adult driver, one front seat passenger, most researchers believe is a protective effect. You have fewer crashes. For a teen, by the way, it's just the opposite. Any teen passenger for somebody in their first 12 months of licensure increases crash risk pretty dramatically. But once they're an experienced driver, one passenger is generally a benefit. Not enough evidence to say that cell phones are causing crashes. Now, John shared some startling numbers with us. I got to tell you, folks, based on our research on this, we think those numbers could be double what he showed. And the reason is we don't have a good way to collect crash data. And it's nobody's fault. It's not NHTSA's fault. It's not law enforcement's fault. It's just very difficult to do this. We had the same problem in the early days of drunk driving before we could legally take blood from people and before we had invented breathalyzers. Remember, we did this thing on the side of the road and an officer made a subjective decision on whether they thought somebody was drunk. We pass laws, we figure it out how to measure it. We have no blood alcohol content test for, sir, were you distracted by your cell phone when you ran that red light? Can we subpoena cell records sometimes in states that don't have laws against it? It's harder to do that because the driver wasn't doing anything illegal even if they were on a cell phone. We can generally get them in civil cases, and a lot of times that's where after the crash report has been filed, after the information has been transmitted to NHTSA, we go back a year later and find out it came in a civil case that the person was on a cell phone, caused that fatality. We did a demonstration project. We looked at 180 known cell phone fatalities, and we had a criteria. We went through the vast majority of them, the driver admitted they were on the cell phone. We looked at 180 fatalities over 2 years. Only half of them were in the FARS database as cell phone-related fatalities, only half of them. Those were the ones we know were caused by cell phones. We think that's kind of the tip of the pyramid. There's another segment under that where we suspect it but can never know. You know, maybe somebody saw them but they don't admit it and we can't get cell records. And then there's another maybe even bigger chunk where there's no way to know. There's a single car crash, young person drove off the road, hit a tree. Were they texting? Were they reading a text they got 10 minutes before, which wouldn't tell us anything from cell records? So even of the ones we know, the top of the pyramid, we think the FARS data is only 50% correct. This could be a much bigger problem than we realize just because there's no good way to collect the data. And I got to tell you, I'm kind of pessimistic on this. I don't see a good way in the near future. We've done a great job of enhancing crash reports so we used to not even have boxes for people to check. Now I think all states have that. We've done a better job, but still they got to rely on the driver telling them. And as long as we got that link, that's the weak link. We're always going to have bad data. By the way, somebody from NHTSA a long time ago said an absence of statistics does not prove or even indicate an absence of a problem, just means we haven't been able to measure it yet. What about CB radios, navigation, books on tape? Yeah, these are all good questions, and some of you have dispatch issues. You got to worry about your employers. I call them CB radios. I guess that's somebody told me that's an old term. They're just radios now, right? That's a form of communication called simplex. You don't have arguments. You don't have long conversations. You say information, you wait for a response, it doesn't have to come immediately, and the conversations don't last very long. We aren't aware that they're causing crashes. You know, I'm not sure it's anything that's been studied, but remember the frequency is way down, the mental engagement isn't as much because you don't have to respond immediately. If you got a driving task you got to take care of, you take care of the driving task before you reply. We think it's probably an okay way to dispatch. Navigation, as long as you're not inputting navigation while driving down the road, is probably a safety enhancement. Okay, navigation is a distraction. Old days we used big maps. I remember my dad driving with this whole field of vision blocked by a map. You know, it just scare us to death. So navigation is probably a safety enhancement as long as we're not putting in information while driving down the road. Books on tape, we've actually studied this. It's just not a big distraction. You can break away from it. There's a difference between having a conversation with somebody, because it can be an argument, it can be a sales call, it can be emotional. They're not all that way, but they certainly can be that way. Books on tape is more like listening to talk radio. Yeah, you might get emotionally engaged, but you can break away from it much, much more quickly. Okay, we'll move into the solution and then we'll go on. NTSB. In 2011, I won't read this, but they came out with a recommendation that states pass laws banning all cell phone use, handheld and hands-free. Okay? OSHA, what does OSHA say about it? OSHA has only addressed the issue of texting and emailing, but what they've said is if that's a part of your business practice where somebody feels obligated to text or email while driving, and believe it or not, I hope none of you in this room, but some organizations are dispatching using text messages to cell phones. But if you're doing that and they become aware of it, you can be cited under the general duty clause. Okay? National Safety Council in 2008, early 2009, we issued a call for a total ban on cell phone use. Now, where did this come from? You heard in the introduction, we have 20,000 corporate members. Many of our corporate members, one sitting here in the room where you're going to hear from later, ExxonMobil from here in Texas, came to us and said, look, our researchers have looked at this. We think it's a very significant safety threat for employers. We think you ought to look at this. So we did, in conjunction with a lot of advice from our members, we called for a total ban. And I'm here today to tell you that best safety practice today for an employer, you're going to hear a lot more about this afternoon, is to have a total cell phone ban for your employees. And I'm also just going to give you a sneak preview. You can do that, you can enforce it, and you can do it in such a way that your business will not suffer, as hard as that might be for you to believe. I know it was for me in the early days, and I've been an employer my whole life, but we'll share the details of that this afternoon. Here are just some of the companies. There's several Texas companies on here that have total cell phone bans. By total, we mean handheld, hands-free, all employees, not just certain classes, okay? This is a sample cell phone policy. This is also from a Texas company. I didn't even realize that when I put it up here. I like it because it's real simple. They gave me this 7 years ago. So they've had it for a long time. But they say, if you're an employee of this company, you may not use a cell phone and drive any way, shape, or form. Handheld, hands-free, texting, talking, nothing. If any one or more of these 5 conditions exist. Number 1, if you're driving a company-owned or leased car. Number 2, if you're driving your car, but it's a company business trip. Number 3, if you're on company property. Number 4, if you're using a company-owned or leased phone. Or number 5, if you're using your own phone, but it's a business call, period. No cell phone use. Simple, straightforward. That's the whole policy right there. Okay, I'm going to put all this together. I'm going to share with you a few stories, and I think we're going to take a break, and we're going to hear from my friend Todd. Talking on cell phones and distracted driving crashes are a huge issue for us. Crashes in general are a leading cause of fatalities in this country. Human error causes the vast majority of crashes. Cell phone drivers are 4 times more likely to get involved in a personal injury crash. Their reaction times are slower than 0.08 blood alcohol. Hands-free, just as dangerous as handheld, causes us to look but not see anything in our environment. 37% reduction in the part of the brain we use for the task of driving, and cell phones are involved in 26% of all crashes. Wow. Again, for a threat that to any great degree didn't exist just 10, 15 years ago. Think back to the video. Things have changed dramatically in our lifespan, in our business careers. I got down here at the bottom. We're going to hear more about this afternoon. Voluntary compliance is very difficult. We need to understand that as safety people. This is different than getting people in the habit of putting on seatbelts. It's very compelling to stay connected on a phone. It's very hard to not answer a ringing phone. I made the decision 10 years ago to stop using a phone while driving. It was very difficult to do. I had to get in the habit of putting it in the glove box or the trunk for a few months until it was easier, because I'd forget to turn it off, or if I turned it off, I'd forget to turn it back on when I got out of the car, and when it rang, I just almost had to look. Have you ever taken a phone away from a 15-year-old and watched their reaction? Could there be some addiction properties to this? Now, most researchers don't like to call it that. I got to tell you, I got off an airplane a year ago on a Friday, left my phone on the plane. I was going out Monday. I went back, the phone was gone. I had trouble sleeping that night. I mean, I'm embarrassed to admit that, but I didn't know if I could get a replacement on Saturday. I didn't know I was possibly going to get through Monday or the week without a phone. I mean, there's something about this that's very, very compelling. What that means is well-meaning employees trying to follow a company policy, or people trying to follow a law, or kids trying to follow a parent's rules. Well-meaning people may have difficulty doing this, which means there may be other things we need to look at, like technology solutions and some of this other stuff. Okay, a few takeaways. We need our full attention for the task of driving. Multitasking is a myth. Think of it this way, folks. Driving in and of itself has distracting requirements. We mentioned navigation. That's a big distraction. You could argue checking a blind spot's a distraction. We're taking our eyes off the road, but we have to do it. As long as 90% of all these fatalities and crashes are the result of human error, why would we want to introduce more distractions for the driver that have nothing to do with the task of driving? Why would we want to do that? Now, if the day comes, and maybe it will, where cars can't crash into themselves because of crash avoidance technology, or all cars are driving themselves, then fine. Then the driver can do anything. But as long as 90% of the crashes are caused by driver error, why would we want to make it easy for them to update Facebook while driving down the road? I mean, we laugh. It just doesn't make sense, does it? Hands-free is not risk-free. Risk exposure is what makes cell phones such a big deal. That's why you hear us talk so much about it. That's where we can save the most lives. All distractions are dangerous, some more than others, but you got to also consider how often we're exposed to the risk. That's a big part of crashes. A total ban on employee cell phone use while driving. It's your best safety practice, and it's also your best defense against liability, which you're going to hear from right after the break. Okay, I want to tell you a couple stories. I'll stick around up here and answer questions, and plus we're on a panel this afternoon where I'll have plenty of time to answer questions. So.
Time for questions, so it's interactive, please. We love your speech, but we need more interactive nature.
Okay, we'll have time this afternoon for that. I want to tell you a few stories, okay? And the reason I'm doing this, we're going to hear some more at the end of the day today. I found out when I got in this business, we need three things to change behavior and culture. We need understanding. Hopefully, maybe you've learned a few things this morning. I think you'll learn a lot today. We need some kind of environmental structure. That's why policies are so important. Laws are important. There's got to be something that says this is okay and this isn't. And then lastly, we need to get our heart engaged. And that's why victim impact stories, MAD prove this, have been so impactful in changing culture. And with that in mind, I want to just share with you a few people I've met along the way. Erica Forney. Erica Forney is 8 years old, riding her bicycle home from school. She went to an elementary school in Fort Collins, Colorado. The Forneys lived in that neighborhood. She's riding her bike home from school. It was the last day before break, just before Thanksgiving. And stay-at-home mom was bringing her kids home from school. She was talking on her cell phone. She didn't see Erica in the bike lane. She hit her, and Erica died 2 days later on Thanksgiving Day. Changed the Forneys' lives forever. Cognitive distraction. She was not texting. She was not dialing. She was talking on her phone. Jay and Jean Good had just attended their daughter JC's graduation in Western Pennsylvania, a small college. She graduated with honors. JC and her parents were on their way home to Eastern Pennsylvania. They were stopped at a red light, and a truck driver veered to miss a young man who ran the red light while talking on a phone. Talking on a phone, not texting, not dialing, and hit their vehicles that sat there. Jay and Jean were killed instantly. JC was given a 10% chance of survival. Maybe some of you have heard her speak. She's doing pretty well today, although she has lifelong disability. She has a brain injury and some paralysis. But she speaks full-time on this subject, very compelling speaker. Margay Ski was on her way home from a school bus in Central Florida. The school bus was stopped, its flashers were on. A distracted, fatigued driver was talking on his cell phone in a truck, didn't see the flashers on the bus, didn't see the bus, there were no visibility issues, no obstructions, slammed into the back of the school bus. Miraculously, nobody died on impact. Bystanders were rushing on to get the kids off. The last one on the bus was Margay. They were going back for her, and the bus burst into flames. Her mom believes she probably burned alive on that bus. Heather Hurd. Heather Hurd was on her way to a wedding planning session at Disney in Central Florida with her fiance. Her parents were there waiting for her. They were stopped at a red light. A trucker texting with his company slammed in the back of the stopped traffic. Heather was killed instantly. Her mom and dad have become real advocates for this issue. It went from planning a wedding to burying their daughter. All because of cell phone use. Every one of these stories, we've lost somebody because of cell phone use. There's a lot of volunteer organizations that have popped up around this, victim groups. Focus Driven is one organized and supported by the National Safety Council, modeled after MAD. A lot of good victim stories on their website. Speakers available if you're interested. And then I want to just close with the event that happened in my neighborhood back in '04. This is a 4-lane divided highway, urban highway. These are 2 northbound lanes on the top, 2 southbound lanes on the bottom, and cross street. Okay, the cross street was crossing with a green light. It was 4 o'clock in the afternoon. The 2 northbound lanes were stopped. But in the 2 southbound lanes, there were 4 cars and a school bus. In the right-hand lane, there was nobody in the left-hand lane. The driver of this red vehicle sped past the cars and the school bus, talking on a phone and looking straight out the windshield. We know this because witnesses saw her doing this in the bus and the cars that were stopped. She was looking straight ahead, and she didn't see the red light, and she didn't see the 4 cars and the school bus that she was passing, and she didn't see the steady line of traffic right in front of her. This blue car wasn't the first car to cross in front of her. It was the 3rd or 4th, bumper to bumper. She slammed into the blue car. She had a late model vehicle that had one of these crash recorders on it. When they pulled the data, it showed she never touched her brakes. Slammed into it at 48 miles an hour. When I saw this information, this crash report, I couldn't believe somebody could make a mistake like that. I mean, I can't imagine a drunk driver making a mistake like that. And I was a heavy cell phone user at the time. I looked at the research and said, my gosh, why don't more of us know about this? The resulting crash seriously injured a 12-year-old boy. He died 8 hours later at the hospital. He never regained consciousness. His mom was taking him to an after-school event, just like so many of us do. She never saw the car coming. You know, when you're the first one through a green light, you might look both ways. You're the third or fourth, you don't necessarily look. She heard him scream. There was this massive impact. That was her vehicle. He was sitting right there on the passenger side. He really didn't have a chance. And he died 8 hours later. And as many of you know, he was my son. And guys, it's been 10 years, and not a day goes by that I don't think of Joe and miss him terribly. He was our youngest son. He was a lifeblood and spark plug of our family. He was always talking, always cutting up and joking. The last thing my wife ever heard from him was him screaming as he saw this car coming at him, all because of a phone call. Not all because of a phone call. It's so hard to reconcile this. This was, 10 years ago where we didn't understand the risk as much as we do today. We understand it now. And I just want to say, and I'll repeat some of this afternoon, there's no bad guys in this story. We invented these products to start with for businesses. And we developed our business practices around them. I developed business practices around them. We didn't know there was anything dangerous about it. I think a good comparison may be 100 years ago, we invented the best fire retardant insulation material ever known to man. We put it in all our buildings. Found out later it was a carcinogen, asbestos. And it's kind of the same thing. We built these with good intentions. But we're at the point now today where we really have no reason to not know better. Todd will hit that a little. The National Safety Council has looked at this. Many employers have taken the lead on this. Employers led on seatbelts. I don't know how many of you know that. We've saved millions of lives because of seatbelt use, and it was led by people like you guys. We can do the same thing with this issue. We can be leaders. Hopefully by the time you leave today, you'll have the information and the ammo you need to do that. Thank you very much. God bless. We'll talk to you this afternoon.